And I want to say what I've received from you in this whole 4 days is the polarity point, and just my heart opening, and just that Cancer, nurturing, emotional. It's such a gift that I'm feeling. I was just reflecting on it this morning that in the nature of evolutionary astrology, souls come together that know each other, and it's so healing to be with a tribe that way. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. My pleasure, sweetie. My Capricorn rising has a Cancer descendant. So I had this imprinting from my father that said women don't know how to manage money. You remember I said that? So as Pluto started entering Capricorn, it became very, I said I have to educate myself on this one. All right, everyone, welcome back. Good morning. Thank you for showing up on the last day. Appreciate all of you being here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So as we go through this archetype, or the last quadrant, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, this is the group, the other, as broad as we can understand it. So as we move through Libra, Scorpio, Sag, was more on an intimate level and finding our understanding of the world within us. Now we have to take all of that we've learned in relationships and our cosmological understandings, and we have to put it to practice and to use in the world. We take those Sagittarian beliefs and we create Capricorn rules and customs. And so Capricorn is everything that we've been studying over the last few days. I'm not going to go over what's all the details in your handouts. The fact that it is the social maturation process, and it's how we find our identity and authority out there in the societal world. It's also how we create society, how we come together as a country, how we come together as a group, how countries establish their own identity, how countries go through their social maturation process. Mark and Patricia will work a lot of this archetype on an individual level, so I want to concentrate on this archetype on a collective level. I'll show you individual example, and of course when we look at what we're going to study with the Capricorn archetype, we have the planets in their signs, in their natural houses when we look at transiting Pluto in the 10th house. So I'll get a little bit of individual in there. But we are looking at, such an energy, an archetype of how groups of people come together. And the United States, you see that I put several different charts in your handout. I'm not going to go over them in detail because I've only got 2 hours and 3 archetypes. But I will just briefly tell you that there is a DMC chart in there. And that I should have put that one as a 1776 chart. David McCullough, the historical author who did the John Adams book that turned into a mini-series. He's done many books that way. He did one in 1776, which is the history of the United States. And in his research, what he found was that the signers of the Declaration of Independence finished signing it July 2nd, 1776. So that's where that chart comes from. And then it took 2 days for that information to reach George Washington when they started, and established themselves as a country. So that's where that chart comes from. The Sibley chart is the most commonly used chart, and that comes from Ebenezer Sibley, who was a gentleman in London, and I think he was a physician. But he had done some research and published some information about 10 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. And so that is the most commonly used chart, and that's the one with the Sagittarius rising. And when 9/11 hit, it was in the middle of Saturn and Gemini opposing Pluto and Sag. Those 2 planets were exact. Pluto on the ascendant, Saturn on the descendant of that chart. And so we got into a very lively discussion a few nights ago on what chart do you use, what chart do you use? And I was impressed with the things that Maurice Fernandez had to say about the Sibley chart. And so I thought, and of course me, with all my planets up there above the horizon, I'm like, and Jupiter and Mars in Libra, 9th house, I'm like, well, can't we just use all of them? So, I couldn't make my mind up. I'm like, well, I'm not going to be the one to, so that's why you have 4 charts for the United States. And so the chart that Jeffrey Wolf Green always used was the Gemini rising chart, which was the one that put it early morning on July 4th, and it gave the United States a 9th house Pluto. Now, in the Sibley chart, we have Neptune in the 9th house, and that's a 2nd house Pluto chart, which would, deal with a lot of the resource issues. But, United States wasn't founded for necessarily religious reasons, which is what we all think. The history of the United States is economical. So whatever chart you use, it's a Pluto in Capricorn. And then I also included a chart by a late astrologer named David Sulte, which was always called the Scorpionic chart. And that was the chart for when when all the states ratified this Declaration of Independence and this coming together as a country. And that chart's set for 1977. But you will find that throughout it all, that we are a Pluto in Capricorn country. And so as I was studying over the last 3 years about Pluto in Capricorn, and it led me to researching finances, monetary systems, and touching in upon this. And I found it fascinating that so much of the history of the United States is based upon monetary freedom. And so it's not always written up that way, but the information's there if you want to go search out for it. And so what was happening when all of the colonists came over here and started establishing things, they wanted financial freedom. They wanted financial freedom from the King of England. And of course, the taxes and the Boston Tea Party and all that kind of stuff. Well, what the colonists did is they started their own currency. And they started their own what we call monetary system. And they did very well with it and survived quite well in being able to create capital that would then build infrastructure. And that didn't sit well with England. And so that's really how, it's a strong undercurrent. And to me, I think, one of the main reasons why all of this war happened in the United States, broke free from England for that reason. You will also find that, and I have to go through this very fast, very briefly, in the 1860s, when Abraham Lincoln was president, and we went through the Civil War and freed the slaves. What happened when all of that was coming up on a financial viewpoint is that the United States did not, the Yankees, the North, did not have the money or as much of the slave labor to finance the war. And the banking interests, the United States history has always been, well, let me back up and explain a few things. What we had coming along, and this was the 1600s, and I didn't research what planets were. This is just the brief history of financing. We grew up on the barter system when we would trade a chicken for grain, and we would trade material goods. And then eventually we would use the metals, where we would use gold and silver and the precious metals and trading those for goods and services. And it would happen that the people who accumulated gold would deposit their gold with the goldsmiths. And what the goldsmiths found was that people would only take out approximately 10% of their gold at any time, and they try to leave the rest of it stashed. And so when we started switching from gold to paper and coming up with paper rather than the actual coins that you go back far enough. When we started switching to paper, okay, I'm just going to call them reserve notes, okay, all right? When we started switching to paper, they figured out that they could create more money in circulation that way. And so when they started switching to paper, it would always be backed by gold that was sitting in deposits. But as they switched to paper, they created what they called the fractional reserve system. Fractional reserve system. Out of our stash of gold, we would only take out a fraction of it. Okay? And so what then the bankers and the goldsmiths figured out was that they could lend out more than they actually had in their stockpile. And they found that as long as they kept a reserve of 10%, fractional reserve, that they could pretty much be okay. Of course, whenever a panic would hit and everybody came and got their gold, probably a few goldsmiths didn't live very long because there wasn't enough to give out. Okay? So, the United States monetary system has always been a battle between private control versus public control. And it's still going on today. And if you study the history of different countries, it's always been private central banks. The central bank is the banker's bank. Private central banks versus public central banks. Okay? That's been the history of the battle of the United States, all right? And they've tried to create public central banks several times. And as a matter of fact, I mean, they've created them, but Abraham Lincoln lost his life for it. He created what's called the greenbacks to finance the Civil War. When the war was over, he announced that he was going to keep the greenbacks in circulation. A month later, he was assassinated. That part's, again, not the common story in the history books, but there it is. And so this fractional reserve system, what it means is if somebody puts in $100, they can take that $90 and loan it out again. All right? And so what happens with that fractional reserve, for every $100 that you put in, you can turn it into almost $1,000 worth of loans as long as you keep that 10% there, because that's approximately all people would ever come out and get. And so as we created this paper, this was the United States left the, when Pluto was in Cancer, okay, that was in the 1930s, okay, that was when the United States started breaking away from the gold standard. And then they kiboshed it, I think, in the 1970s for good. So we haven't been based upon anything that was really tangible for a while in this country. And it's all just paper. It's all just paper. And as a matter of fact, the biggest thing that I want to tell you about is we all noticed what happened in Pluto and Capricorn in 2008 when when Wall Street was playing fancy games with numbers and computers, and they got caught with their pants down. And us taxpayers bailed them out. Well, those guys used that to balance their banking sheets, okay, because what happened during that time period, many, I'm trying, I've got so much to say, I'll try and be clear about this. After the 1930s, when there was a run on the banks, and people didn't have Social Security. Social Security came about during that time period. They also set up banking standards that was known as the Glass-Steagall Act, in which banks had to keep, so much on reserve, and they had to be able to prove it, and they had to be able to back it up. That Glass-Steagall Act was, Reagan started destroying it, Clinton finished destroying it. So this is not a Democrat or Republican thing. Pluto in Capricorn is always about keeping the masses controlled. Doesn't matter. It's more of a it's beyond the politics. Okay, it's money interest. It's the haves versus the have-nots. It's not a party issue. Okay, so when this Glass-Steagall Act was destroyed, what it did is it kept your commercial banks separate from your investment banks. And so what happened in the 1990s and 2000s is your commercial banks and your investment banks merged and started playing around and playing in the markets and doing things. And we won't even get into derivatives or any of that stuff. A website, if you really want to educate yourself on this, and I would ask all of you, please go to this website, read every single article, called webofdebt.com. Webofdebt.com. You can purchase the book. It's by Ellen Brown. She's wonderful at really educating us. This is where I've learned a lot of this knowledge, webofdebt.com. But these banks, as they've been creating all these exotic financial instruments to gamble with and got caught with their pants down, we bailed them out. They had taken that fractional reserve system down from 10%, always having 10% of capital left over on paper. They had taken it down to as low as 2%, 1%. That's why you've seen banks collapsing, okay? And so they've been stockpiling and holding on to this money because they had to clean up their own balance sheets. Because the bankers all have what we call the International Bank of Settlements, okay, that exist over in Europe. And they're forcing United States banks, England's banks, Australia's banks, Europe's banks, they're forcing these guys to try and clean up their act, okay? So all these banks use this bailout to help themselves. None of it reached Main Street. All of a sudden, all these states in the U.S. got caught with, we have cycles of expansion, cycles of contraction, inflation, deflation. Pluto is typical for creating deflation, which means that the cost of goods and services go down, the money in circulation goes down. And the money in circulation has been going down. And the other thing that we've done is we don't have that tangible physical money anymore. Most of us have debit cards and credit cards, and we do it on paper. We do it on paper. We do it in computers now, okay? So it's just what we say we have. And so that money supply has been contracting with Pluto and Capricorn. So all of a sudden we have all these United States, and they can't balance their budgets. And it's a dire situation in states like California and Florida and Illinois and all those states that used to be all the industrial, Wisconsin, Michigan, and now this unemployment. And we're seeing this, and it's not moving. And it's not going to change fast, okay? But to me, the biggest point to realize, okay, is that the history of the United States, the history of England, the history of Australia, the history of the European, it's always been a behind-the-scenes battle between the control, Capricorn, over the money supply, between what we call private banking versus public banking. And so all the banks have to have what they almost call a central banking system that will create the actual physical money that's in circulation, that'll be the clearinghouse for all the paperless money that goes back and forth. In the United States, that battle has went back and forth between public control and private control. And there have been public central banks in the United States. There was 2 of them. The second United States, wait a minute, I'm getting confused here. Apologize for that. There's been private central banks, and we've actually had presidents in the past who've null and voided them and destroyed them. Andrew Jackson destroyed the last private banking system, and he did that in the 1830s. Between the 1830s and 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created, there was all this big behind-the-scenes battle going on in the United States for the control of the money supply. And in 1913, they created what we call the Federal Reserve Board Act, and that chart's in your handouts. And it's got Pluto at 0 degrees Cancer. It's got the Sun at 1 degree Capricorn. It's got a lot of Cancer Capricorn in it, and it's activated. And so this is why I'm just trying to bring this out, because the Federal Reserve is squashing all the stuff in the news about this kind of stuff. But the Federal Reserve Board Act established a private central bank in the United States. So our banking system is controlled by private interest. And who are those private interests? It's the 12 branches of the Federal Reserve. And who has all the shares of those 12 branches? The private big banks and their shareholders. And so and I could lecture on this for a while, but I'm trying to be very fast, so I'm fracturing and going, okay, that point's not important, this point is important. Michelle?
Are people who actually in ruling power allowed to sit on the chair, on the boards of those 12 banks?
No, they're elected positions. I mean, they're appointed positions.
But can you be in both? Could you be an elected official and can you be appointed to a
You
bank?
can work your way up through the private banks and be that way. And that's
Can you hold a federal office?
No.
no.
So that is a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it doesn't.
Go from one to
But
the
you have to,
Go from one to
yeah.
the other, make your friends.
Yes, Tim Geithner was the president of the New York Bank, Federal Reserve Bank, and now he is the secretary. So yes, you can go back and forth that way. Okay, I was misunderstanding your question. Here's what I want you to understand, because when I started studying this stuff, it can get very depressing. You're like, oh my God, it's all controlled behind the scenes by private money interest. Well, guess what happened? And there's a beautiful example in Canada, and there's a beautiful example in the United States. And it comes from the Northern Plains. When we were going through the early 1900s, which was Pluto and Cancer, and all this battle was going back and forth in Congress. And by the way, the Declaration of our United States, the Bill of Rights, or the Declaration, I get those confused. But our country gave the right to control the money supply to Congress. And when the Federal Reserve Board Act was passed, Congress kept the right to the coins. Pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters. It gave the Federal Reserve note rights, or that paper exchange right and the paperless right, away to the Federal Reserve Board. That's what happened in 1913. And so, but what happened then in, I think it was 1919 in North Dakota, and I think it was 1930-something in Alberta. Alberta and North Dakota, as a state and a province, they were going through the railroads and all of the control of the grains and the resources, and they were very populist, okay, in those days, and populist for the people. They decided, we're going to create our own banks. And so the state of North Dakota created a state-owned bank. It operates through the Federal Reserve, but it's owned by the state. Alberta did the same thing in their province. And so it's legal to do that in both countries, okay? And so what they did is they created their state-owned banks, and they said, all of the state's capital must go in our own bank. So they have to put all their income in that bank, and they get the interest off of it. That's another point I'll touch upon in this talk too. So they created their own banks and forced all the state resources to go into that bank. And they used that the interest they would make off of loaning the money back out to create their infrastructure. So guess what? The only state in the United States that has a budget surplus is North Dakota. 600,000 people, and their unemployment rate is 3.4%. And they're sitting on a 1.3 billion surplus for those few citizens. And everybody says, well, that's just because that state is so small. And they get all of the oil and gas reserves from their resources. No, it's not. In the fractional reserve lending system, when you loan out money and you have to pay it back with interest, you create the income from that interest. And so that's what they do. But what does the state of North Dakota do? Instead, because it didn't want to get into battles with all these private banks, it started working in collusion, or not collusion, I don't want to say that word. It started networking in cooperation, thank you, with all of the other private banks, okay? And so it buys up all of its real estate loans of the private banks there, and it buys up all the farmers' loans that the private banks loan out, and it just acts like a mini central bank with all the private banks, so they all get along very good. But what it does with all its interest is it puts money back into infrastructure. North Dakota also has one of the best grant programs for kids going to college. And so it's taken all of this interest that it creates off of loaning out again and again and again all of its own resources and creating its own interest, is put it all back into the state. Alberta did the same thing. The Commonwealth of Australia did it from 1912 until 1994, when the private money interest sold it off. And now they're trying to get it back again in Australia. If you go to webofdebt.com and you read the most interesting, the latest article, she went into the research of the Commonwealth of Australia, and it's just fascinating, because here's how the banks create money today. This is how everybody does it today. I spent before I got into astrology, my background was always accounting. Trying to get past all that Capricorn conditioning from my father. Women don't know how to manage money. If you go to a bank and they loan you $1,000, most of you will put that money in your bank. The bank deposits $1,000 into your account. That bank then comes over here and knows that it has to get $1,000 back from you. The bank charges you 10% interest. Okay? You have to pay back $1,100. That bank gets that $100 in interest. Okay? That bank takes that $1,100 it's going to get from you. It's required to keep 10% of it as capital, as fractional reserve requirements, okay? So then you got to subtract that $110 that it's got to keep in its account as a reserve in case you default. That leaves it over. I'm going to now simplify the math, okay? That leaves it left over with somewhere between $900 to $1,000. It has this left over. It can take this money and turn around and loan it to another person. It can now loan another person $900, charge them $90 interest. In other words, today, all of your banks create money by debits and credits. There's no more gold that it's backed by. There's no more, again. So when somebody starts up a bank, that fractional reserve allows them to multiply the money, multiply the money, multiply the money. And so this is how any bank can do it. So when we create a public bank and a state-owned bank, guess what? They don't have to charge you 10% interest. Banks can charge themselves. In other words, the Federal Reserve right now is charging all its other banks 0.25% as they loan amongst themselves. How much do you pay when they loan you something? So there is a Democrat in the state of Wisconsin or Michigan, one of those Midwest states, that just won the Democratic primary. and he is running on the platform of creating a state-owned bank in Illinois and taking all of the income that that state makes off of registering your car license and your state sales tax and all that stuff, and putting all of that money into the state-owned bank. The state collects the interest off of that bank. It takes the interest off of all of the money it brings in, and it loans it back out to the people. There was someone running on for office for the governor of Florida. I don't think he won his primary. He wanted to create standard 3% interest on mortgages. He wanted to pay out 6% CDs. So in other words, again, I can't get into this in detail, but I think I've given you enough information just in this little bit. You go to webofdebt.com. She explains it much better than me. This is not hard to learn. You've got to learn this, and I want you to be a dandelion in the wind, because this is what's going to come over this next decade. And I'm hoping, as Uranus squares Pluto, that what will come with this is more people will learn from this, and then the states and the states' rights in the United States, provinces in Canada, we can create our own banks, you know, and it's not to say that corruption can't come there. It can, but we can create our own banks, and we can loan the money back to the people at decent interest rates, and we can take the interest made off of that, and we can put it back into the crumbling infrastructure. Pluto in Cancer, when they came through and created all this infrastructure, you know, that then came through the war, all that infrastructure is crumbling. Pluto in Capricorn, we've got to come back. I mean, and so there's hope. It's easy, and it's easy to do, but it requires educating the masses. And I think this is what's going to happen with Pluto in Capricorn. Just like back in 2 Pluto and Capricorn cycles ago in the early 1500s, the Catholic Church did not want the printing press to come along. Up until that point, the people couldn't read. They couldn't read the Bible. They had to just believe what they were told. Now here we are in this internet age again, 2 Pluto and Capricorn cycles. It behooves us to educate ourselves financially. It behooves us to educate ourselves in how our economic and monetary systems are run. So as we go through 7 Uranus waxing squares to Pluto, we can take back the people's collective right to have a say in how we financially operate on a collective community level. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox. But when I figured that out, I'm like, all my Pluto and Capricorn fears just went away. It just dissipated. And then when I realized that Uranus was going to go into Aries, you know, and that waxing square and the crises in action, that we've got to manifest different structural reforms. We've got to manifest different infrastructures. We've got to manifest different economic monetary systems. I'm like, oh, I got to tell everybody.
How do you educate the consensus masses of 70% of our population who do it this way, because it's always been done that way?
Good point. How do we educate the consensus? You go up to a consensus person and you say, would you like financial prosperity? Would you like hope in getting out of your mess? Would you be willing to let me talk to you about this? But you've got to educate yourself. And I'm not really good at explaining it. And if my husband, who is a former stockbroker, was up here telling this story, he would have been much more efficient than me. There you go. There you go. She said you only have to educate 20% of the people because that's all that vote. And so again, if you will, and listen, this is how North Dakota and Alberta still operate. And so all these, California, Florida, Illinois, their budget crises are extreme. And so this word is going to spread because there's not any help from Wall Street to bail out Main Street. And this stuff started coming out in 2009 when Pluto went into Capricorn and everybody started questioning, who is this Federal Reserve? How do they keep track of that stuff? And that started coming out in the mainstream press, and the financial elites, the financial haves went, and this is what can happen again with Pluto in Capricorn. So now that we've got all of this electronic, internet, web-based stuff, you know, educate yourself. It's not hard to learn this stuff. Lee? Here, hold on. You're fine.
So what I know, the advice would be is to put your money into a credit union or into a
Yes.
state bank.
Yes, good comment.
Get it out
Good
of the
thing.
big ones.
Your credit unions are much more financially solvent than any of your major banks. So if you want to know where to put your money, you should put it into a credit union, because credit unions are the banks that are publicly owned. There are publicly owned banks in the midst of all this.
And don't they reinvest in the local community?
Yes, they reinvest in the local community, and their financial solvency is pretty much very, very good. Very good. They also have a tendency to pay just a little bit better interest on their certificates of deposit. They also have a tendency to have just a little bit lower priced loans. They're still FDIC insured. After the dirty 30s, when all the banks collapsed in the 1920s, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was created. Okay, and so that's now our banking systems are insured, and your individual deposits are insured for either up to $200,000 or $250,000, which means most of us are protected for the most part in any of our banks, private or public. Is there a financial backing to the FDIC, the Federal Insurance Deposit Corporation? Well, a good question. It's just the good faith of the United States and the Federal Reserve itself, which has been kind of hairy behind the scenes, and which is why all these major banks have been trying to clean their act up, because the International Bank of Settlements, which is over in, I think, Switzerland, all of the banking interests are, you know, Europe's older than the United States. That's where all this stuff has come out of. That's where the J.P. Morgans and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Rothschilds and all those banking names, that's the stuff where it's controlled behind the scenes. And they were the ones who got the Federal Reserve Board Act passed. Okay, so enough on this. I just feel it's so important to get this out. You know, and I've now educated 50 of you this weekend, and you're going to turn around and educate 50, and they're going to turn around and educate 50, and maybe by the time Uranus makes its first Pluto square and we have another crisis of some sort, you know, we can do it. There's the 7 waxing squares of Uranus to Pluto are 2012 to 2015. And they happen between 8 and 16 degrees of Aries and Capricorn. And those will affect the United States chart, because the United States Cancer is right around 13, 14 degrees Cancer. And that's when Pluto's going to be opposing it, and Uranus is going to be making a waning square to the U.S. United States. Where's Saturn? You girls, you know where the United States... No, natal United States Saturn. No, not transiting. No, natal Saturn of the United States. Libra. It's Libra. Yes, and it's right in those degrees Libra, and so this will be the economic crisis to come yet with the United States. Honey, I have my contacts in. I can't see it. Thank you. So, yes, hold on. Where's my little canary?
Plus, the Federal Reserve Board has Pluto
Pluto at 0 degrees Cancer opposite the sun at 1 Capricorn.
Yes, and this information almost came out when Pluto went into Capricorn and opposed the Federal Reserve's natal Capricorn, and it was suppressed, Pluto and Capricorn. So we got another chance of it coming out, and I'm bound and determined this is going to come out. So, Monica?
I wondered how we have Saturn square Pluto for the last time here on August 21,
Yes.
which is coming up. So I'm thinking as you're speaking, we're right in that hot zone
Yes.
with the waning square between Saturn and
Yes, we have the
Pluto.
last Pluto waning square. But
then that ties into the U.S. chart with a natal Saturn and Libra.
yes, yes, it does.
So I'm wondering how what you're speaking now, because I think you're speaking directly to that shift in consciousness.
Yes, it's happening
How
for
is it
all of
going
you.
to kick into the United States natal Saturn and these upcoming Pluto-Uranus squares?
I think what's happened is all of the financial elites, the Pluto and Capricorn halves in the United States has suppressed this information. Everybody thought we'd have catastrophe in August, and we're not. It's being suppressed. So it's just kind of like it doesn't exist, which then means it builds it up to happen bigger when the first Uranus square Pluto hits in 2012. So, you know, who knows? Maybe there'll be another disaster. We'll see some stuff in the news economically, but they are trying so hard to suppress this information, which then means that, you know, in consensus state, consensus recycles everything. We all have a tendency to recycle, but when consensus recycles it, it recycles the same old BS over and over again. Okay, so hold on. I had a couple people over here. Okay, so only a couple more minutes, and then we've got to move on.
No, I just want clarification about what it is that's being suppressed. What information?
The truth about the fact that our monetary system is controlled by private banking interest.
I just had a couple of comments. One is from my experience last night when we were doing that archetype, and I had those Cancer people opposite me, and they were saying, "What do you need?" And the first thing was money, and I was ashamed to say it. But then when I reflected, I was like, "Wait, that's Pluto and Capricorn," and so I just wanted to kind of name that. And then the other thing was, I've been really reflecting about how on our currency it says, "In God we trust." It doesn't say in money we trust. You know, it says in God we trust, and maybe somehow all of this will bring us a little bit more back into the fact that it doesn't really come from paper. It comes from some
Yes.
kind of...
Yes. The ultimate resource source itself. That's where it comes from. But as we create these Capricornian customs and structures to operate together as a group, we have to know how those structures work so that we can evolve them. One more...
The other thing I wanted to point out is you can't look at mainstream news and plan to get the real story, because the government has managed to, if you look at even what they do with the press, they embed them in wars, etc. They put the news people and allow them access where they want them to be.
Yes.
And then it's like kind of an old boys network. Then they have a favor to the government.
Yep.
So, you know, you're not getting the real story all the time. And the other thing is, if you'll notice that newspaper companies are now forming conglomerates
Yes.
that, you know, have big interests in agreeing with the government.
And all that came about,
The free press is not so free anymore.
no. And all that came about with Neptune and Capricorn, when Neptune transited Capricorn. And so now bless that Uranus-Neptune conjunction that happened in the early 1990s, you know, and then Jupiter coming along with Uranus and Neptune and exploding the internet. The internet is the new printing press. And so here we are with our ability to educate ourselves again and not allow another Pluto and Capricorn cycle of suppression to happen. One more, and then I do want to talk about it. I want to give the example individually, and I have to move on. But
there is some things happening now with where they are trying to suppress the internet. I mean, that is
Yes.
happening right now, too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Suppressing, controlling the internet. Look at how China's controlling the internet. Look at how some of your more totalitarian regimes are trying to control the iPhones and the internet and all that kind of stuff. We will have to stand up for that type of stuff as well. Okay, you are the last question or comment.
I was just going to say, you know, the fact that Pluto has been denied, I mean, the whole consensus is suppressing even the existence of the planet. So whatever it's touching, it's gonna, you know, it's gonna bump into that where the consensus is gonna suppress it, even in its unconsciousness, like
Yes.
consciously or unconsciously. So
Yes, 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 yes. Okay, I wish I could describe this, explain all this better. Some of my little trauma is still triggering me. But I think I got the point across. And so there's all kinds of financial hope, and it's real, and we can create it, and each of you are going to be a dandelion in the wind. So when we look at this on an individual basis, all right, and we look at this example here of when all generations have Pluto transiting Capricorn. There's a Sunday church service going on. All right, I sure can. Do you need to turn this on some way, Leroy?
It should be on. On the mic itself, you can turn on, yeah.
Hello.
Now you tell them again so they hear it on that side.
You know, and so Pluto and Sag, how we had all of, and that was, you know, the tail end of that was those Saturn-Uranus oppositions and all that polarity that's been going on with fundamentalist religion. You know, that stuff is going to start ebbing out in the United States. It's not that it's going to go away. It's been here for a long time. It's going to continue on. But if there's one area where Democrats and Republicans and liberals and conservatives and New Agers and fundamentalists will all come together, it's their pocketbook. And that's why it's like, how do you educate the consensus? This is one subject they're going to be so willing to listen and discuss and learn. So, all right, I'll get off my soapbox. But I mean, I'm sensitive, and I got Pluto in, you know, that 8th house. Where's my security? Okay, here we go. I think this is it. Yes. All right, so when we have transiting Pluto in the 10th house for any generation of Pluto, all right? So we're switching back to the individual again. It's all of these archetypes that we've been speaking about. The individuals who have Pluto transiting the 10th house are going through a reality crisis. They're going through a career crisis. They're going through, why does my life not work anymore? And so it can create that involution, that deep, deep inner reflection, so that they can look at how they have put reality together, and they can shift how they need to do it. So sometimes that Pluto transiting the 10th house, they've been laid off in this economy. Sometimes they've got the job, but they just can't do that job anymore. And how am I ever going to be able to leave my job in this economy? So with what I've told you on a collective level, there is some hope, because what we can recognize in this room is we operate from natural law, regardless of the Capricorn conditionings. And so people with this type of a Pluto transit in the 10th house can find the courage to Uranus in Aries, bust out, break free, and create the new ideas, the new ways, the new realities for themselves. They're going to have the courage to let go of the relationships, Saturn in the 7th house, that are no longer working for them, and the people that are going to tell them, are you nuts? You want to quit your job in this economy? What are you thinking about? They're going to have to learn who they're going to listen to. Libra, 7th house, the psychology of listening. Because what's going to happen, again, for all of us, this is going to, some of this example right here is true for all of us because of the planets and the signs. All right? And what we got is Saturn going through Libra, through Scorpio, through Sag, until it conjuncts Pluto in 2020 again. I think it's one time. And somebody correct me if I'm wrong on that. It's in your handouts. But so there's so many old realities in these various relationships and beliefs and understandings that these people have to let go of, that all of us have to let go of. All the things we've been told about how reality is structured are crumbling. They no longer work. They no longer make sense. This is what Saturn is doing and making sure that this old, it's operating with Pluto to make sure that this old stuff is let go of. And then this Uranus over here, in Aries for the next 7 years is going to say, the new will come in one way or another. The new you. And again, Aries first house, we may not know what that newness is going to be like. And so one of the ways that Uranus in Aries has to operate is on an instinctive gut level. And remember that Uranus, as the individuated unconsciousness, one of its elements is also the blueprints of the future. Those are those future-orientated messages that pop into your head all on their own when you're doing the dishes and driving in your car. The element of repetition to the future-orientated messages tells you the directions you are supposed to go. The example, there's, the two common examples with this example right here is that you keep getting this repeated message to leave your job and create your own business, or to leave this occupation and you're meant to go back to school and start something else, learn another trade or another talent. The message will be unique to each of us, but that message will keep coming again and again and again. So if the message comes once or twice, it's either fantasy or wishful thinking, or it's way down in the future, 10, 15, 20 years from now. If the message repeats itself all on its own, and I like to say that future-orientated message is either clairvoyant, clairaudient, or clairsentient. We see it, we feel it, or we hear it. And if it comes again and again and again and again and again over several months, over the course of a year, that is the direction you are meant to go. And many times in Uranian fashion, that message will be in stark contrast to the reality we have put together for ourselves. And it requires courage to step forward into the unknown and breast free and do it differently. And be able to discern all of the messaging that comes from everybody else in our life and know who we should listen to and who we want to say, thank you very much, I'm going to think for myself. That's what's going to be required with the Saturn in Libra or the Saturn in the 7th house. Yes, Maureen?
My son, that you just nailed it for my son. He's Sagittarius, Mercury or Pluto in the 10th house, Uranus in Aries in his first house, and he's unemployed and he's trying to find a new career, and he's getting all kinds of flack from the world.
Yes.
Go get a job, go do this, go do that. He's getting unemployment and he shouldn't have to. This is his time. Yeah, he's being nailed. He's being crucified by his friends.
Yes.
Because they're plugging into their fear about,
Yes.
oh my God, what would happen if that happened to me?
They're plugging into their fear, and I'm not saying this is the case for your son, okay? Please hear this. Collectively, all of those good intentions about being able to help the masses when the crises and chaos hits on these big cycles, that's why we created unemployment, that's why we created Social Security. But we also, because of this broad base Victimization, power lies outside of myself. We also create collective societies where I'm a victim to that power outside of myself. And so there can be, there will be those that will abuse the system. We don't give them a helping hand up. The parable of Jesus, if you give them fish, you feed them for a day. If you teach them how to fish, then you teach them how to do it themselves.
Kim, I wonder if you want to just say something about, so this is Pluto in somebody's transiting through someone's 10th house. So that's only a certain population. But the whole world is being affected by the economical shift. So how do you integrate it? Like, let's say you have Pluto transiting to the 8th house. You could care less about because you're so doing your Pluto 8th house thing. But because the whole world is being affected, is it something simple that you could say about, or
Any house transit, any house that Pluto in Capricorn is transiting through is still going through these lessons. Because of the sign, yes, exactly. And I said that earlier. I said while we're using this specifically as Pluto transiting through the 10th for any generation, this example is true for all of us because of these slower moving planets moving through these signs. This is a generational example for everybody. It's just even more impactful if you happen to have Pluto transiting your 10th house. It's a double signature. And if you have Pluto transiting another house, you've got two examples over the course of these 4 days that you've got to blend together. Does that help? That clear for everybody? All right. We've got to do a tape change. Just a few minutes. Our coffee showed up. Go to the restroom. Let's get back and do Aquarius and Pisces. All right, everyone. I had a Pluto in Libra come up over the break and give me a very nice example, so I just want to briefly mention it. Not you, but we had another one lose her job. But I had a Pluto in Libra who's going through her Pluto in Capricorn square. And she just had, it was you, right? Yes. She just got a very nice promotion. And so all of those positive things that can come about, they came about through her Pluto, transiting Pluto, making a waxing square to her natal Pluto in the midst of this T-square. So someone else asked me over the break, I don't look at any aspect as a negative aspect. Any aspect can be negative, any aspect can be positive. And as this woman shared with me, and I'm not remembering your name, and you don't have your name tag on, it's okay. Anyway, as she shared, she had been trying to do her work, knowing that this Pluto square was coming up, knowing that this T-square was coming up. And it came up for her, and she got a beautiful job promotion. So just want you to remember, it's, again, not all cut and dried. The other thing from this example is many times, and this is generic, when you see a natal 10th house Pluto, through this Pluto in Capricorn transit for all of us, through anybody who has Pluto transiting in the 10th house, when the career is blocked, when our ability to achieve our goals is blocked in the outer world, we must go to the Cancer polarity and learn whatever emotional lessons we are avoiding. Remember, any planetary archetype works through its polarity, and the polarity point of this Pluto in Capricorn is Cancer, and that's the evolutionary intent, bringing back the community, going back inward to emotional self-reliance, working through our emotional lessons, finding our inner security, will then allow us to go back out into that outer world and see those changes reflected there. All right, now as we move on to the archetype of Aquarius, I get a little bit of feedback once in a while. So Aquarius is that Uranian archetype because Uranus rules Aquarius and the 11th house. And so everything that Mark has been speaking about off and on throughout these last 4 days is what's involved in that Aquarian archetype. Aquarius, Uranus, and the 11th house is the archetype of the individuated unconsciousness. And again, the 3 types of information that each of us have in our own unconsciousness that's unique to us is the past in all its detail. Mark calls it far memory or long-term memory. I call it past lives. It's all our past lives. It's all the unconscious stuff from our childhood. It's all there in Uranus. And we can access it in hypnotherapy. We can access it in regressions. We can access it in a variety of different ways. It wants to come out on its own. The archetype of Uranus, Aquarius, in the 11th house is also everything we suppress via Saturn. When Saturn doesn't want to deal with it and it pushes it away and it doesn't want to think about it and ignores it, that goes down below the surface into Uranus, Aquarius, in the 11th house. That also contains the blueprints of the future. And again, I discussed that a little bit earlier. How you pay attention to that element of repetition, to the future-orientated messages that tell you what is coming ahead. So Uranus, Aquarius in the 11th house is always where we can get our own information about the direction we are trying to go, the future. Now, one of the things that's also happening with this archetype, and it's been happening for quite a while, and it's because of the distortions from natural law. When we, eons of time ago, when we lived back in our more natural communities in more tribal ways, the shamans would be there to heal the trauma immediately. The trauma wasn't allowed to be extended or suppressed or ignored like we do now. So the shamans would be there to heal the trauma immediately, and we had different concepts of, moving in and out of form, in and out of these physical bodies. We didn't see the death and the loved one leaving as traumatic as we do today, because we could recognize the consciousness that it would exist no matter what, whether it was in form or out of form. And so with all of this distortion from natural laws, the archetype of trauma has increased and increased. Jeffrey used to say that approximately 85% of souls are born with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And that exists in the archetype of Uranus. 85. And I sometimes think that number's low. Because if we look at everybody in this room, is there anybody in this room who is not traumatized? Oh, Uranus and Gemini has to just tell us. Be contrarian. We could test you. So the archetype of Aquarius is also always trying to decondition and liberate itself, Aquarius following Capricorn. And sometimes that liberation process it's too much. It's traumatizing because it's too radical. We don't look at change in a positive way. It's the conditionings of our society in the modern world, but it's also just naturally inherent within the soul with that dual desire nature, that desire to be secure. That's that desire that has us repeating the separating desires, that has us always trying to take yesterday and project it forward in order to feel secure. It's inherent in human nature. And so because of that, we want to hang out with Capricorn more than we necessarily want to hang out with Aquarius. And so we have to look at this archetype of Aquarius, 11th house Uranus, in a more positive note. We have to be able to look at change from a little more positive nature. We have to walk through the insecurities. We have to walk into that unknown future and create a new. And so this is how this whole archetype of Aquarius has gotten so caught up in the trauma. Because we have this conditioning within ourselves, we have this inherent nature within ourselves to look at trauma as to look at. I know they're getting triggered, and so let's sing that song again. So again, so we have to look at this change. We have to look at this unknown from a more positive viewpoint. Yes, Linda.
Isn't that also true then of the square? I mean, we all connote the square as a, quote, negative aspect, where actually it's a challenging aspect.
Yes.
And challenge isn't negatively or necessarily negative.
Yes. The point that you reminded me of is recognizing that Aquarius is active fixed air. Active fixed air. So we have all this fixed mentalness with Aquarius. All right, and so you can see how the mental trauma comes. Mark was relating this. Pluto is emotional trauma. Neptune is spiritual trauma. Uranus is mental trauma. And Saturn is physical trauma. And you can see this through almost all the elements, but both Neptune and Pluto rule water signs, but you can relate to Neptune as a spiritual trauma. But back to Aquarius in the 10th house being active fixed air. That active part is I want to convince you that my viewpoint is correct so that I can feel secure. So when we get mentally triggered, the mind fractures and disassociates, as Patricia was talking about. And so when we are looking at this example then, and Michelle, will you do this for me? Cross out and put them in the, you know where to put them. So now we're moving into, the fixed modality with this example. And fixed energy wants to sustain. I have a fixed Pluto house, and it's always best if I know about what's coming. What you want to do with your fixed energy, it's what they talk about in public speaking. You tell people what you're going to talk about, then you talk about it, and then you tell people what you did talk about. That's what fixed energy needs. You got to tell them what's coming up before it happens, so that when it's happening, they're not triggered. And then you can help them tell them this is what happened afterwards so they can integrate it. I mean, what I have noticed is your 11th house Pluto's natally, these are, again, that signature is going to be a traumatized soul to some degree. And those 11th house Plutos, you can tell them that you'd rather go eat lunch at Burger King instead of McDonald's, and it just fractures them. Because that was not the plan. That's the energy, okay? So can you see what this Pluto in Capricorn is doing to their reality with this example up here? When you put this transiting Pluto in Capricorn through the 11th house, doesn't matter what generation it is, that transiting Pluto in the 11th house has taken all the reality that they have put together that allows them to have some type of mental stability, 11th house, and it's crumbling. It's getting busted wide open. And so these guys are being re-traumatized. That's true to some degree of almost all of the fixed house Pluto transits, where the transiting Pluto is 2nd, 5th, 8th, or 11th. You've got this T-square going on, and you've got the polarity point with Cancer. So all of the fixed house Pluto transits are experiencing this opportunity to be re-traumatized, re-traumatized. But nowhere does it describe it here than this Pluto transit through the 11th house. All right? And so these guys really have to pay attention, gals too, okay? I'm not being gender specific. These souls really have to pay attention to those future-orientated messages that are coming up. One of the other things that's happening generically with Pluto in Capricorn, because Capricorn's going to represent that Saturnian archetype of suppression, and you put Pluto in there, rumbling up and bringing all that metamorphosis, all of us through Pluto and Capricorn can be having past life memories that have been suppressed, trying to come to the surface so that the soul can understand it and make sense of that. And as Uranus is going into Aries, that means we are wanting to break free from these past life memories that traumatize us and look at them from a fresh viewpoint. So as we go through these 7 Uranus waxing squares to Pluto, any of you who are wanting to be practicing astrologers, I think we have a lot of opportunity for people to be finding you and coming to your doorstep. How can I make sense of this? And so this is just a natural thing that you're going to know. So one of the effects that might come generically from these waxing squares over this decade is more people opening up to reincarnation, because it's the only thing that makes sense. Where are these memories coming from? So, when we have this example here, Pluto transiting through the 11th house, any Pluto generation, Uranus in Aries is going to be over here in this 2nd house, and they're going to have to be creating entirely new realities. They're going to have to be finding entire new survival mechanisms. And it might come down to the basics of food, clothing, and shelter, but it's going to go beyond that, and it's going to be, what are your values? The values are going to have to be shifting. How they want to structure their life and put it together is going to have to be shifting. And, we're going to have souls and consensus individuated and spirituated states all over the planet that are going to be finding their where they live shifting. Just through natural disasters, just through the wars. Can you see how these people are triggered more than some of the other Pluto-Uranus house transits? Michelle Marine has a question.
You said Pluto transiting the 11th are needing to redefine their values.
They're needing to redefine their values due to the transit of Uranus being in the 2nd house.
Oh, okay.
The 2nd house, Venus house, is where we define our values. And those...
Pluto is transiting my 2nd house, and I'm also being asked to do that.
Yes. Pluto in the 2nd house, Saturn in the 2nd house, Uranus in the 2nd house. Through all these examples, whenever you find this T-square in the 2nd house or the Cancer polarity point, that's going to say redefine the values. All right? Saturn over here in Libra in the 8th house is going to really affect the whole relationship commitment thing. Libra, 8th house. We could have the partner find a new partner, and we get abandoned. And all of a sudden, we are stuck, trying to start anew, figuring out how we're going to take care of ourselves while we're trying not to be traumatized. And can you hear me if I hold it here? It's very hard to be the one. So if I hold it here, you can all hear me. Okay, so I have to bring it up here. All right, I'm going to try and... I'm not going to say what I'm going to do. I'm using a body part to hold the microphone. So...
Scorpion.
I know.
Where are you holding it?
So when we have that Cancer polarity point over here in the 5th house for this transit, these souls are really, the 5th house is that, egoic identification. Who am I? And you put Cancer there, and they're going to have to redefine that at emotional levels. And they're going to have to, this 11th house is going to have to go, who am I really? And they're going to have to re-identify how they know themselves, how they are experiencing themselves. This will also affect the whole creative principle, because what you will find when you have planets in the 11th house, that mental aspect of Uranus is extremely creative, but it stays in the head. And the lesson with the 5th house polarity point is doing something about it. That fixed energy, I'm just fine creating all of my, new creative aspects in my head. Whereas the opposite, the 5th house Leo, is doing it, and why won't anybody notice me? The 11th house is fine keeping it in the head, and they've got to get it out into the world. They've got to express it. And so this Pluto transit is going to be asking these folks to recreate themselves and all of that creative energy within themselves in new ways. And all their security identifications through the 2nd, 8th are changing, and their whole life changes, really.
Is that creativity, when you're looking at it from the 11th to the 5th, will that be more mental thinking type of creativity, or is that any kind of creativity?
Any kind of creativity. Any kind of creativity. Because again, because Uranus and Aquarius in the 11th house is always sparking the future that's meant to come for that soul on an individual basis, what's unique to it. It's so easy to keep it here in the head, and it needs to get out. And so it's getting it out there on all levels. Yes?
Well, you're talking about what's unique to it, and yet I'm trying to understand the context of it in that house of, the world out there, that 11th house of
The 11th house?
the tribe of whatever. So
When you have a natal planet in the 11th house, or in this example, transiting Pluto in the 11th house, this is sparking that archetype of community. This is how Uranus will relate to the geniuses, the inventors, and the creators. Uranus is orientated towards the whole, towards the community, towards the collective. And so sometimes it has trouble getting its own spark, Leo polarity, out. It can see what the community and the whole needs. But to do something about it, Leo, is where they get stuck. Yeah, light bulb. This makes sense for everybody with that? Okay, so I'd like to move on now, if that's okay. And how much time do I have left, Leroy? 35. Okay, good. I'm doing good. And so, Michelle, thank you, sweetheart. So now let's move on to our last example and the last archetype, which is Pisces, 12th house, and Neptune. And this is where the other is as large as we can make it. This is the ultimate whole. Whereas Aquarius can relate to our tribe, to our culture, to our society. When it comes to Pisces, it's everything, everyone, all species, all forms of consciousness, all humans, regardless of race, culture, country, etc. And so this is where that archetype of Pisces, 12th house, and Neptune gets to become source energy, God, Goddess, Great Spirit, whatever you perceive it to be, because that becomes the whole on the ultimate level. And so one of the things about the archetype of Pisces is that it contains all other 11 archetypes. Whereas Aries is rebirthing into itself, and it's all me, Pisces is everybody else as well. And so this is where that archetype of Pisces can come out in so many different ways, because every other archetype has come before it. So it can be Aquarian, it can be Leonian, it can be a Scorpio, it can be Taurian, it can be everything. Now can you see how Pisces can get so confused? Who am I? Yeah, yeah. And so Pisces is that archetype. And again, when I say Pisces, or as we've gone through this all 4 days, this thing goes on and off, doesn't it? It's not me.
It's okay right now.
It's the mic. Oh, good. Oh, good. It's not me. It is me. So I apologize. If anybody, if this is going in and out and you can't hear, you might have to come closer. All right? I apologize. So this is where this archetype of Pisces 12th house Neptune is always meant it's about learning how to spiritualize on an individual basis. And as I like to say it, it's where ego has to merge with soul, and it's where individual soul has to merge with universal soul. And that process of an individuated soul that's learning its own unique identity on a soul basis, when it has to merge with universal soul, that letting go and letting God goddess, it is the scariest thing we ever do. Because it feels, water element, it feels like we're losing ourselves. And until we get through that process of the actual merging on whatever way we're doing it, and get to the merged point and recognizing we're still there, the soul resists. The soul tries to figure out excuses, Virgo polarity. It tries to figure out all these different identities. This is where I'm not done exhausting my separating desires, and we create another desire, and another desire, and another desire, and another desire. We manifest it, manifest it, manifest it. Because on a deep unconscious level, we're actually afraid that we're going to lose our own identity in the merging. So the head wants to do it, but that egoic soul level has some unconscious resistance. And if it wasn't there, we could snap our fingers and merge with Source in an instant. We have the free choice to do that, but how many of us do? And the fact that you're still sitting here in your chair, not a puff of smoke as I said that, is your own observation, correlation, that although you want to merge with Source, you have resistance somewhere. This makes sense? So now can you see how Pisces can contain everything, all the archetypes that came before, because you've got to exhaust every single separating desire until you have no more Virgo excuses left. So you can see then also, on a soul basis, why it takes that consistent, conscious effort, Virgo polarity, to merge with Source and address your excuses. All right? Yeah. So the other thing that will happen then with this Pisces archetype is what we call the Neptunian void. So as we are having another exhausting desire, we're manifesting it, we're actually living it, and then it collapses. That's that process of trying to help us learn where the ultimate source is, what it is, how we're going to remerge with that. many times when that manifested desire or reality, Virgo polarity, collapses into disillusionment, it is not immediately replaced with something else. We're stuck in the Neptunian void. Jeffrey's example would be, you're on a small rowboat, you have oars, you're in the middle of the ocean, it's foggy, and you don't know what direction the shore is. You have no choice but to go inward and find your connection to Source from within. And as you tap into that and touch into that, you learn those Piscean lessons of faith and trust. And eventually, miraculously, you find your way. Terry?
In Eastern philosophy, these samskaras that have been spoken of translate to impressions. And each lifetime we collect these impressions, good and bad. And exhausting those impressions is what brings about the liberation.
Yes.
And we have to even exhaust the good ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. We have to exhaust everything manifested. Good, bad, and in between. Mm-hmm. So, does this help with an understanding of Pisces, 12th house, Neptune, for you all? Again, I have Sun conjunct Mercury conjunct Neptune between 1 and 2 degrees Scorpio. So, I pondered this and looked for help. When I found evolutionary astrology and this westernized concept of saying it, which is what I just did, I was like, oh, I'm not crazy. So now can you see why? The distortions of Pisces, the imprisonment, the craziness, some of the things that you read in all your cookbook astrology about Pisces, Neptune, and 12th house. Now you understand where all that stuff comes from. Now you understand when we cannot cling to that Virgonian earth reality and we have to be in that existential void. I don't use that word because I don't know how to pronounce it. Existential. So,
Could you repeat what you just said, because I loved it. They're not the existential void, it was about the imprisonment.
yes. Yes.
The imprisonment?
Well, okay, repeat it again because, yeah, I did.
You were talking about the distortion of Pisces, the imprisonment.
Yes, so that's how you can see, you can have all of this collapse of self that has no identity with itself, that void. So sometimes when we're left in that void, if the soul and ego structure is strong enough, we come through it. But if it's not strong enough, you can see how that becomes the tortured souls, the possessed souls, all of that stuff. Yeah. And when you come across those kind of souls, you don't have to say this out loud. You can just say it within inside yourself. You give them energy and you just tell them, God is within you, God is within you, God is within you, Source is within you, Goddess is within you. You can just give those types of souls that type of energy. You see how you're giving them their power back. And you're helping them reach from that existential void. I want to learn that word. You know, I don't care, but I want to learn that one. And so you can help them get past that void and recognize that sense of self and claim their own power back. Because I didn't talk a lot about the sadomasochistic conditioning that comes through Virgo Pisces. There's a lot of it written in evolutionary astrology. But it's all based upon this concept that the source of power lies outside of ourselves. Okay. That the source of power lies outside of ourselves rather than within. I'm tired of this. Sorry. And the music stopped. It could. It could. We'll change the battery for Mark. So I'm going to find my voice through Pisces. Yeah. And so, thank you. And so, this is typically Virgo's the sadist and Pisces the masochist. But in reality, both sides of this spectrum can be sadomasochistic. Okay? The masochist is where we take on the conditioned guilt. We internalize the guilt whether we're guilty or not. And we believe that we deserve to be hurt. Or we deserve the punishment. We try to continually atone. The sadistic side of it is where, on some deep level, I got to get them before they get me. Both are distortions, okay? But they're all based upon, both sides of this distortion polarity is based upon the source of power is outside of ourselves. So we know this. We know that there is some big cosmological consciousness and energy out there. And it's all within us. We've got to recognize it within us to recognize it outside of us. Okay? And so one of the best things that you can do as a practicing astrologer, for those of you who want to do that, otherwise we all learn it personally, is just claiming our power back. And in natural law, we're allowed to be in our own authentic power. Source energy isn't trying to take any power away from us. It is trying to empower us. And so what we can do as human beings with other human beings is this concept of healthy boundaries. It took me a while to recognize unconditional love does not mean powerlessness. It means healthy boundaries between myself and another. Unconditional love is neither selfish nor selfless. It's a healthy self. And so again, this is what we've got to do, is work to give other people their power back. So when the codependent people come up to you and want to give their power away to you, you have to put up your hand and refuse. No, excuse me, I'm going to give you your power back. I'm not going to be responsible for you, just like I don't want you to be responsible for me. And so when someone's trying to take our power away, we have a right to defend ourselves and put up our hand and say, no, I'm going to be my own source of power, thank you very much. And this is a Pisces-Virgo lesson. And it's gotten very confused through the patriarchal conditioning. I'm just trying to figure out what God wants me to do. See how powerless that sounds? You see how that source of power is outside? And so I've talked to God my whole life for as long as I can remember. We all have. But I was kind of like, always having my conversations with God. That was popular. And because I have the 8th house Pluto at 2 degrees Virgo, I've come through lifetimes of powerlessness. So this has been a personal lesson for me to just go, Source doesn't want me to be powerless. Wants me to be in my sense of power. So it is a conversation with God. That's why I created that little prayer that we did. That was my own personal prayer that I created for myself to empower myself, to embody that source energy within myself. And that's what we're always learning to do in the archetype of Pisces in the 12th house. This stuff makes sense? Question?
I just want to gain a little bit of clarity on how you see this God source that's trying to empower you versus the soul that is trying to kind of direct kind of like the small self or the ego in this life. So, I mean, it becomes somewhat blurry in terms of, because what does soul want? Or what does God want? And is it, one and the same? And trying to find that. So, you know what I'm saying? So
Yes. And you have the freedom to be in your confusion until you clarify it. That's ultimate source giving us ultimate freedom. Because we are in an evolutionary process and we are not perfect. If we were, why would we be here? So in this process of perfection, through all the imperfections, there are cycles of confusion and clarity. Confusion and clarity. And that exists in Pisces and the 12th house Neptune archetype. And that is why, as soul thinks, this is what I want to do, and I believe that this is an expression of myself expressing God when I do this. If it gets to a point where it no longer serves my soul, I've exhausted the reasons for doing whatever it is, it will disintegrate. And we will go through that confusion, that void, until the clarity comes again, and we really get the message that Source is trying to help us get. Does that help? I know. Any astrologer who starts to talk about Pisces, it's very hard for it not to disintegrate into confusion. Okay, you give her, you help Terry, because you got a lot of she's got a lot of Neptune energy. She'll explain.
I think I understood your question differently. I look at it kind of this way, and
Why don't you speak up?
Okay, I'm looking at it this way.
I'll repeat.
There is the ego, which is like the center of a drop of water, if you will. The drop of water is the soul. And the drop of water happens to be plucked or part of the ocean. Does that help you?
Yeah, no. Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe it's that Neptunian thing that's going.
It is.
But yeah, I think it was just, when you're saying, you pray to God every day, and you're saying at the end of the day, the power is within you, yet we're sitting here, and I hear you saying in the sense that, it's the chart is the vehicle to help find what the soul is looking for, is what, in a sense. So that is the piece of, ultimately, that I wouldn't say the clarity, but it is somewhat of a guide map.
Yes.
That can help you to find where the soul wants you to go,
Yes.
which is why God empowered you in the first place.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, that's good. Another. Whew.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hold on. Okay, go ahead.
What I was going to say, what I understood you to say, is that when the dissolution occurs, basically the path that we've been on is, Spirit is asking us to adjust the course a little bit. That's how I'm seeing it.
Yes.
And so that dissolves so that we can go back in a little bit deeper
Yes.
to get a little more clarity about how we need to adjust. But that period of confusion can last a while.
Yes. Yes.
Based upon, I don't know what all. But
Yes.
anyway.
Yes. When soul's on a course that's not its highest and best good, and it dissolves, it leads us back inward on a deeper level for greater clarity to then come back out again. It's another way of saying we exhaust the separating desires, and when these separating desires are completely exhausted, we will have expanded into consciousness again in a more evolved way. Hold.
Great confusion precedes great wisdom.
Great confusion precedes great wisdom. There's another way of saying it, very Piscean. Hamada?
I have Pluto in the 12th house, and when it happens, it feels like it's the end of the world. It's not just, oh gee, I'm confused right now, this thing must be over. It's like life is over now, and it's a big thing. It really feels like I'm not going to wake up tomorrow.
Yes.
I'm going to be dead.
Yes.
So it's kind of like it takes a few of those, and they're never the same, but it takes a few of those to develop the trust and faith that it ultimately it will work itself out somehow, that you don't have to like mentally figure it out.
Yeah.
And for someone like me with the sun in Gemini and ascendant in Virgo, there's a real desire or belief that I can figure it out.
Yes, a 12th house Pluto with a Virgo rising and a sun in Gemini thinks she can figure it out on a mental plane. But she's that 12th house Pluto, when you run into one of those disillusionment or disintegrating or exhausting the desire situations, it feels like it's the end. It feels like you're not going to wake up tomorrow. That's where it feels, that's where the soul feels like I was saying, the soul feels like it's going to lose itself. And it takes going through that process, especially for natal 12th house Plutos or Pluto transiting your 12th house. You have to go through it a few times before you recognize tomorrow comes, or the expansion of consciousness comes, or the reunion with Source on a new level comes, and you're still there in your expanded self.
Just quickly, so that, you know, when you have a north-south node axis, 6th house, 12th house, and in the 6th house, when you experience that existential void, it's because you are lost from source, and the 12th house is your polarity point for the north node. So to have Pluto in the 12th house, her polarity point, the 6th house, grounds her in, you know, in reality, in the information, in the practicality. It's like you have to go to the 6th house to save yourself, whereas when you're in the 6th house and you're in that void, you got to go to the 12th house, you have to go to the source. Does that make sense?
Yes. Could you hear that well enough in the back with that? Okay. Glennis has been, okay, go ahead, and then Glennis.
So, the void, is that comparable to the dark night of the soul?
Yes.
Thank you.
Would you just talk about the surrender part of this archetype?
The surrender part? I like to say, and that's how I was going to speak about Lourdes' question a little bit too, because I said it earlier. You know how ego always has to merge with soul? And you know how the consensus state, they're running around in their egos, and it takes a crisis to get them to even acknowledge the soul. You know, and then they have those, you know, pray to God moments. If you get me out of this mess, I promise to be good, and I promise to blah, 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 blah. And the crisis passes, and they're right back in the ego running the show again. Okay, whereas most of us in this room, we're all still very familiar with our egos. But we're familiar with this inner part of ourself that is the soul that's really becoming more conscious. And it's like an inner guidance system. It's that part of yourself that says, well, I want to do this, but you know, I recognize that what's best for myself is something else. We're starting to recognize that, and we're in this process of trying to merge ego with soul. And when we merge ego with soul, the ego becomes an expression of the soul. Ego never disappears when you're incarnated. Jesus had an ego. Okay? Yogananda had an ego. Ego doesn't disappear. It becomes of service to the soul. That's how individual souls operate when they merge with universal soul. That individual spark of the soul is still there, but it's at one-ment with universal soul, and it expresses itself in the world, knowing what universal soul would like it to, how it would like it to express. And with that merging, that individuated spark of soul expressing universal soul is still expressing itself and feels fulfilled expressing itself. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right.
I've never heard Pisces done so clearly, and it must be because, no, seriously, I am, for me personally, and you have transiting Pluto Pluto going through your 12th house.
Yeah, guess what? Here, this example, this is me. Yes. Yes. And so what will happen then, okay, is in all this Piscean stuff that this Pluto in Capricorn is talking about, I'll start with Pluto. What happens is current reality exists, it crumbles as the soul has put life together, as the soul understands life. Sometimes that crumbling is an outer reality, physical stuff. Sometimes it's an inner reality that crumbles in the 12th house, okay? Now we're dealing with the modality of the mutable archetype, which is adapt and adjust. Pluto in the mutable houses is the easiest transits, okay? That means the 3rd, 6th, 9th, 12th houses, 12th house transits of Pluto are more or less easier archetypes because it is an archetype of change and adaptability. Oh, this isn't working anymore. Why not? What do I need to change? All right? So again, everything we explained about the 12th house, when Pluto's in that 12th house, many times what we have is the exhaustion of a separating desire. The most distinct example that I could give you is running Jeffrey's school for 6 years, thinking I would do that for the rest of my life, and Pluto went into my 12th house, and I reached the Y in the road with my teacher, my guru, and I had to let go of an earth teacher to move into a deeper level of universal teacher. Okay? The Uranus in the 3rd house in Aries then, when that surrender process happens and you are not resisting it and you merge with it, I mean, do you think I had any dark nights of the soul? Am I supposed to be an astrologer anymore? Phew, went through that one. You know, and so then when you come outside of that dark night and you have the remerging with Source, what will happen from Uranus and Aries in the 3rd house is Source then uses you as a voice to bring in evolution, to bring in new thoughts, new ideas. Oh, well, I really think, you know, I like this concept of creating a workshop over 4 days, and each day 3 archetypes, and each teacher is going to do those 3 archetypes on different subjects to really help ground the people who come in the 12 archetypes to really help them get astrology. And then the Saturn in Libra, and I thank you for letting me use myself as an example. But it doesn't just have to be astrology, okay? You understand that, okay? The disillusionment with the reality, inner and outer. The remerging with Source on some level to spark new desires. Even exhausting desires are good. It's the process the soul learns by. And as it does that, then having all of the insights come through to be a voice for Source in new ways. And over here, the Saturn in Libra in the 9th, this is the teaching archetype. This is being able to structure stuff for people. And so there's all of that, you know, the 9th house is the Sag archetype. So it's the archetype of the teacher. You put it in the 11th house, and again, you put it in Libra. I've really done pretty good without doing my Mercury-Neptune dyslexia that I sometimes have had. But to put it in Libra then over that 9th house, sometimes it's teaching one-on-one, for me in my case, doing the readings, but Libra can still also be groups of people. It's the other. And so it's the others, you know, and so there's a philosophical thing that comes through all of this also. And the Cancer polarity, when you emerge from the void, that Cancer polarity in the 6th house, There can be emotional healings that are transformational for the body. That are and the emotions can be a source of getting out of all of the confusion and judgments. I've noticed as I've went through this Pluto transit that my Virgo nature is lightening up. And that's that 6th house polarity point. You know, I still got to tell you when I got the Saturn ingresses wrong, but other things. Oh well, I'm getting very good at going. Oh well. That's what's going to happen, and that's what's going to happen if it's on a positive note when there's an emotional integration. If the emotions are being denied and suppressed and not addressed, those negative, distorted emotions will crystallize into health crises with this transit.
And 6th house is of service and it's a mentor. So you are being of service as a mentor to us.
Yes. She says the 6th house also works as of service and mentoring. So in my example, I am learning how to be of service to all of you as I mentor you.
That Saturn in the 12th, Saturn in the 9th, I'm seeing it as a deconditioning belief that you needed a teacher.
Yes. Good one. Deconditioning the belief that I needed the teacher. All right, we're down to 5 minutes. And I...
We give them to you. Okay.
So I thank all of you for allowing me to do this, to mentor you. I thank all of you very much, and I'm going to try not to cry. So thank you. I'm a hugger.